Hi, I'm Andrew Douglas from Bryn Mawr Film Institute, and this is Ask Andrew. Each week, I answer a few questions that are submitted to me via our website. You can go to the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and submit your question via the Ask Andrew form. Please send in any questions that you've been having about film or film related topics, and maybe I'll answer yours in a future video. Okay, on to our first question for this week. Michael asks, my question is not a direct question as much as a conversation about Quentin Tarantino's films, in that I wonder if one of the reasons Tarantino crosses genres and has so many original novel films is that he didn't go to film school and is not bound by film school conventional theory. Well, Michael, this is a really interesting question, and I somewhat agree with your premise and somewhat don't. I think that Tarantino's movies do cross genres. I think there are original elements and notions in them, but I don't think as many of his films are so wholly or uniquely original as you might think. I think the fact that Tarantino had his sort of informal film school education in a video store rather than attending USC or UCLA or NYU or any one of the number of good film schools in the country does show in his movies, but it shows based on the types of movies his movies tend to be influenced by, and in some cases borrow from, and in some cases borrow from quite liberally. I think we have all seen the influences of spaghetti westerns and sort of B action movies, particularly of the World War II variety. You can certainly see the influence of Sergio Leone in the title for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, for example. And I think that Tarantino has an interesting approach to filmmaking. I think it is original in the sense that he tends not to care about the things that many other filmmakers tend to care about. But I think if you did enough research and thought that you wanted to take the time to try to dig into the influences and homages and elements that are borrowed from other movies in Tarantino's films, I think you find that he is bound by, granted, as you said, different things than someone who typically would have learned about filmmaking in film school, but I think he's still bound by things in general. And I think the extent to which he is unconventional, or he's not bound to conventional theory, as you put it, sometimes works rather well in his films. I mean, Pulp Fiction is a very original work that is still satisfying on narrative and character levels, even though it breaks all sorts of rules of structure and arc and things like that. I recently rewatched Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and there are things about it that are very interesting and very satisfying from a nostalgia point of view and from a sort of star text point of view. But in terms of narrative structure and in terms of character arc, it's not that satisfying, and there are some shortcomings of that film, and a lot of the things that we tend to think are conventional or are thought of as the right way are that way for reasons that aren't as sort of obtuse as we might think. It's not because certain people declared it so. It's often, particularly when it comes to story structure and genre and character arc, it's because that's what we as humans tend to enjoy. And the fact that many movies tend to follow certain formulas or certain similar trajectories, formula may be too strong, is granted a sign of, by definition, a lack of originality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all such choices are bad. There are certain things about the way stories are structured, the way characters develop, the way relationships between characters develop, that are the way they are because we as humans find those storytelling elements more satisfying. And I think that's worth bearing in mind when we all of us critics, everyone tend to sometimes criticize something for not being wholly original. The fact that genres exist and that is or they are a valued and utilized element of filmmaking suggests that there is some sort of extent to which we as viewers like um, a kind of tension between the original and the formulaic, between following rules and bending them just enough. And Tarantino certainly bends rules, he breaks them, he ignores them, and sometimes that can be quite refreshing and innovative, but sometimes I think it's just someone with the filmmaking means and authority to do what he wants and isn't necessarily for as constructive or artistic or creative reasons as we might think. Um, anyway, I hope that answers your question, and I appreciate the question. And you're right, it certainly is a big conversation more than just a question, but hopefully we started that conversation with what you submitted and what I have responded. Thanks. Our next question comes from John. John asks, I'm interested in the history of Technicolor, and I was wondering if Hitchcock could have chosen to film Rear Window in black and white. Well, it's an interesting question, John. I will say, first of all, that I doubt Hitchcock would have made such a request. As you probably know, Hitchcock came to Hollywood in 1939, lured by what was at the time a pretty big contract by independent producer David O. Selznick. And Hitchcock came to Hollywood for a couple of reasons. One was the money, but another was to have the biggest stars and the best technology and the filmmaking budgets and all the sort of trappings and opportunities that what at the time the biggest and most lavish film industry in the world could provide. And Technicolor certainly would have fit that bill. It was an expensive process requiring three strips of film and especially a separate camera to utilize those three strips of film. It was a bigger camera. Everything was more expensive from a materials point of view. Technicolor required that you have one of their special consultants on set. And so it was a much more involved process and a more expensive process to use Technicolor. It doesn't surprise me that Rear Window was shot in Technicolor because with Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly and that elaborate set, Paramount was obviously treating this movie sort of as an A picture, as one of their bigger films for the year. And it would only stand to reason that if you're going to spend that much money on the set and on Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly's costumes, that you would want them to be seen in the full sort of range of Technicolor. In fact, if you think about it, I think every movie Hitchcock made from that year, 1954, Dial M for Murder also came out that year, until the end of his career, with one exception, was shot in Technicolor or some other, at that time, relatively elaborate color process. The different studios used different processes, but the technology was similar, at least during that period. The exception, of course, was Psycho from 1960, which was a black and white film for a few reasons. One, certainly being the budget. That was, by Hitchcock standards at the time, a very low budget film, shot with largely with his TV crew from Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And it was a film that nobody really wanted to finance at a studio level or a corporate level. So it had to be made inexpensively, and it was. I also wonder as well if even the relatively limited amount of blood that is depicted would have been able to be depicted in color, or if part of the sort of censorship or limitation of the depiction of violence was the fact that it was in black and white. In any case, that was the exception, that Hitchcock, for the last 20 years of his career, shot all of his films in color. So Rear Window was bound to be shot in color for that reason. The other reason I would say is that it was sort of, standard for movies from many studios that had big stars in them to be color at that time, unless there was a reason for them not to be. A great example is a film from the same period, On the Waterfront, which was obviously shot in black and white. I think there are a couple of reasons for this, though. It was clearly with Marlon Brando in it, and Elia Kazan and the rest of the supporting cast. It was clearly a sort of a big deal for Columbia. But it was produced by independent producer Sam Spiegel and brought to Columbia, and he might have been more frugal. Columbia itself, in general, had a reputation for being a bit more budget conscious than some other studios. But perhaps most importantly of all are two other factors. One, it really suits the subject matter. Technicolor, because of the nature of the way it looked, tended to give, in some cases, an almost sort of richer than life or perhaps fantasy look to the color, and that was not at all appropriate for the subject matter and setting of On the Waterfront. In addition, there was a lot of location shooting done in On the Waterfront. And as I said, while location shooting with Technicolor cameras would have been possible, it was done for the musical On the Town a few years earlier. It was certainly harder to shoot using the Technicolor equipment on location, and there was a lot of location filming for On the Waterfront. And so I think those are reasons why a film like that, even though in some ways its sort of place in the industry at the time would have suggested it should be Technicolor, it ultimately was shot in black and white. But I think Rear Window was always destined to be in Technicolor, and I doubt Paramount would have let Hitchcock shoot it in black and white, even if he had wanted to. Thanks for the question. Our final question this week comes from Alan. Alan asks, "This week I again watched Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder with a Frederick Knott screenplay based upon his Broadway hit. I also watched Andrew Davis's reworking from 1998, A Perfect Murder. In the credits for the 1998 film, there is no mention of Knott or the play or film as an inspiration. The Davis film is clearly an adaptation of the play and filmed with elements almost identical to the original, the use of keys as an example. Are there any rules that guide giving credit to an obvious source material? How did the 1998 version not at least say this was inspired by Knott's play and film?" Well, you ask an interesting question, Alan. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a flaw in your premise. While I would have expected, as I'm sure you did, to have seen credit given to Frederick Knott's source play in the opening credits, near where screenplay credit is traditionally given as dictated by Writers Guild of America contracts or terms, actually, the fact that it was based on Frederick Knott's play is listed in the end credits right after or shortly after the cast is listed, so pretty early on in the end credits. I will grant you that that is an unusual choice and a bit surprising, frankly, to me. And I can think of two possible reasons for this. One being that some of the reviews at the time, and while I'm very familiar with Dial M for Murder, I only saw Perfect Murder once, and it was many years ago. But some of the reviews from the time indicate that there were actually a fair number of changes from the original material. And so that may be one of the reasons why they didn't feel the need to so clearly identify the source material up front or feel the need to so clearly identify the film as a remake. Most of those changes, although there are a number of similarities as well, as you mentioned, most of those changes, it seems, were not for the better, as the film is not held in as high esteem by critics or audiences as Dial M for Murder is. I think the other reason for this may be that the rights for Dial M for Murder, and presumably the film rights to Knott's play, are held by Warner Brothers, and A Perfect Murder was released by Warner Brothers. And so I think it's possible that because the giving of credit for the basis or the source material would have been something in other cases that would have been sort of negotiated, or terms would have been arrived at between the holder of those rights and the filmmakers who wanted to use them. In this case, it seems the rights were held and the filmmaking company that wanted to use them were held by held them also. It was the same company. And so perhaps they either didn't feel the need to give as prominent credit because they were just crediting a property they already owned, or perhaps the prominence of the credit for source material is something that is negotiated in terms for the rights to use that material, and in this case, no negotiation had to take place. In any case, it's an interesting question. I can't think of other examples or any examples where there's no acknowledgement given, but there may be some. And it was an interesting topic to think about and look into, even though, as I said, as it turns out, credit was given, just not where you or frankly I would have expected to have found it. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you very much for tuning in to this edition of Ask Andrew. If you have any questions you would like to submit that are related to film, please do so using the Ask Andrew form on the Film Studies Online page at our website, brynmarfilm.org. And while you're there, why not check out some of the new release films we have available for streaming, a number of our other activities or offerings. We have a lot of film-related puzzles. We have some neat video segments. In addition to this one, we have our online film discussions every week. And there's a lot to see and do. So please visit brynmarfilm.org and check out the Theater 5 section and the Film Studies Online section to see what's going on and what's coming up.